Chapter 2: The Price of Freedom When Constructed Reality Collides with Truth. In our last chapter, we left our princess with an overabundance of questions blooming in her mind, wondering if the shadows on her tower walls were the whole story. But as her thoughts raced and swirled like a tempest, a voice suddenly rose from the very bottom of the tower, cutting through her confusion like a blade through silk. It promised escape, promised answers, promised the freedom she had only just begun to dream of. Yet not all promises were what they seem. For you see, the voice that had called from below did not belong to the noble knight of legend. Instead, it came from one who carried his own darkness, his own twisted understanding of what salvation should look like. But our princess, having lived her entire life within those tower walls, had never learned to distinguish between the voice of a true rescuer and the whisper of another kind of danger entirely. And when someone who has known only shadows reaches towards what seems like light, how could she possibly realize that some promises of freedom come wrapped in their own chains? Our princess would soon learn that escaping her tower would require a price so terrible that even in her darkest moments within those walls, she had never dared imagine it. Welcome back, Nuggets. This mother clock has got some thoughts. Let's ruffle some feathers and get into the video. And if you would like to support my baby chick of a channel, please consider liking and subscribing, and don't forget to go check out all my other videos. Now, normally I say that these chapters are standalone and you're more than welcome to watch them in whatever order you wish. However, this chapter is a direct part 2 to my first video on Gypsy-Rose. So if you haven't done so already, please head back and watch that one first, because there's going to be a lot of context that will be missed if you don't hit that one first. So I'll leave a little card and I'll link it in the description below as well, so you can go check that out and then come back here and watch this one. Thank you. Okay, editing future Vera here. I just wanted to do a little bit of Coop cleaning regarding my previous video. So a couple of points that I want to just address very quickly before we move back into the recording. Now, a lot of you are mentioning emails that had surfaced, unfortunately, between my doing the research for this video and writing over 10,000 word script for these videos and my actual releasing of them. And as you probably know, if you've been following along my journey, I've gone through a fairly rough last couple of months, and it just caused me to completely miss this. So that's totally on me. I accept that. Now, the thing that is being raised is that a lot of you think that these emails will cause a change in perspective in my mind, which the prospect of that really excites me, because my nuggets, you know, this mother clocker likes to think about things. So I have actually recorded these 2 videos 3 times now. The first time was just a file corruption. The second time I recorded while caring for Miss Pink, and it has her little voice on it. It also had a positive update about her, and I just could not bring myself to reopen those files. So then I recorded it a 3rd time, now to find out that perhaps some facts have changed. The thought of recording this video a 4th time makes me want to cry. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to release it as it was recorded, with the knowledge that my next chapter, I'm going to start deep diving on some Freedom of Information Act documents that had been released, plus the released emails. And I thought what might be really fun is to actually use this one as a baseline and then move on to the next one to see and analyze, does it change things from my perspective, having actually lived the life of an FDIA survivor? Will I still maintain the same perspective, or am I going to become irate potentially at Gypsy for using a very difficult experience that people like me have gone through for her benefit to basically kind of get away with unaliving somebody? If that is the case, I'm going to be let me just say my feathers will be ruffled if that is the case. But I'm interested to do this exercise, and if you allow me the little bit of space that we do that and to analyze it, I think this will be a really fun exercise to do. So I do have all the documents. I do have all the emails. I have not looked at them yet, nor will I be watching anybody else's videos who have covered it, because I would like a clean perspective on it. You'll be getting my raw reaction to it, basically. So as of this video, it has not been seen by me. And so in this fun exercise, there might be things in this video that you know that's something that I don't know. And it'll be like watching sport. You can yell at your devices. You can tell me, but we will be getting to it. I promise you that, my nuggets. Now, I do still want to release this video as it was, because remember that what I'm proposing in this video is not necessarily the way I think it is. All I'm doing is presenting an alternative perspective based on a really specific set of events that I have lived, and potentially laying additional complexities to a story that perhaps people haven't thought about. In essence, just asking, hey, here's an alternate perspective. Have you considered this? Does this alter your opinion or perspective in any way? Does this add any potential context? Or hey, is it completely useless? I'm not at all saying that it is the fact and it is the way it is. It may not be in context at all. The importance of these questions is because none of us were in that house. There are so many factors that all of us, including the court proceedings and the jury and the investigators, could have potentially missed. I'm here to say, this is what I've experienced. This can exist in reality. Could it possibly apply to this case? All I'm doing is bringing forth what I see, what I've lived, and similarities that I see in my mother that translate to Dee Dee very, very clearly. So please do keep that in mind as we move forward. For those of you who want a little bit more black and white from me, here's the reality of what I actually think. If you want me to get out of the, the perspectives and the spuriousness, I think that what Gypsy did was heinous. And I think that there's absolutely no excusing it, which I mentioned in my previous video. I don't think that Nicholas is necessarily just a villain. I think he's also a victim of this crime, and that's what makes this so unbelievably complicated. And that's what I mean by, living in this world of uncertainty and unsureness, because it's so important to account for all of these factors when we're examining stories like this. And I am uncomfortable with her being out of prison and not Nicholas. And I'm not necessarily saying that they should both be out, and I'm not necessarily saying that they should both be in. I just think that the imbalance there, because when we think about like Charles Manson, for example, who basically fried for his crimes, he never actually physically unalived anybody himself. And I think that when we're looking at people who essentially point an assassin at somebody, they should be just as culpable for that crime. That's how I feel about this, if you need my black and white thinking. But what I do on this channel is look at different angles and play devil's advocate, and to think and look at things and consider these things, even if it's uncomfortable to do so. A lot of this video also, why I wanted to still release it in the form that it's in, most of this video is not actually going to be about Gypsy's story, but it is going to go into a research and analysis of FDIA compared with malingering, which is a very, very interesting rabbit hole to delve into. And I'm also going to highlight a little bit of a philosophical structure that might help, and I know that there's a lot of you listening, might help those who have gone through something in childhood or have a parent who gaslights or, does any sort of that toxic kind of behavior. It might pose an image or a story in your mind that helps you reconcile these thoughts, because it absolutely was the thing that got me there. So I think it would be a loss to my channel to not include this. Okay, so I think that's everything that I wanted to cover. Let's get into this video, and I'm really excited to get into chapter 3 because we are going to do it all, my nuggets. Young adulthood, aged 18 to 23. Control escalates as questions grow. The desperate years. Before we get into this bit, you might find a little bit of a tone shift. As I mentioned in my previous video, there are going to be parts of Gypsy's story where I lean more into empathy territory for her, and then there's going to be parts where I lean away from it. And the previous video was only speaking about a minor who I think we need to be very careful about putting blame on children when they're in a situation that is less than ideal. And no matter what you think about Dee Dee, no matter what you think about Gypsy, the facts point to this was less than ideal, to put it lightly. And now we're going to be speaking about Gypsy as an adult. And while I'm not exactly sure how much intelligence I would credit Gypsy with, I don't know. But I do credit her with enough to know that life is not a fairy tale, and you don't get a knight that sweeps in and, saves the damsel after slaying the evil monster. I don't necessarily buy that she believed that. Something that I might buy is that she felt like there wasn't another way out. Now we move into what I call Dee Dee's desperate years, and it starts with a discovery that changes everything. In 2011, doctors finally found something real. Gypsy was diagnosed with a chromosome disorder. And what's more, this disorder actually explained many symptoms that Dee Dee had been claiming for years. The muscle weakness, the feeding problems, eye issues, developmental delays, hearing problems, and even potentially the dental issues. It was all there in Gypsy's genetics. But here's what's fascinating from a behavioral standpoint. Dee Dee tested negative. This disorder must have come from her father's side. And when the doctors wanted to do more testing to understand the full scope of this real, very real condition, Dee Dee just said, "I'm happy my daughter's stable. Thank you for finding this," and declined further investigation. Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, that's clearly a mother who's not entertaining her daughter being sick and not enjoying it. But here's where my perspective comes in. If you remember from my first video, my mother spent years fabricating elaborate health issues. But when I actually got glandular fever, a real illness that needed real treatment, she completely ignored it. When I first heard this about Gypsy's story, I thought, oh, well, then that's proof then that Gypsy is lying about everything. And then remembering that about my experience, well, yes, it could be that Gypsy is lying about everything, but it could also be that FDIA is a much more complex, much more layered, and more multi-motivated situation than perhaps we realize. Because why would my mother enjoy all of my illnesses so much to the point of claiming them as trophies to brag about, but then ignore my glandular fever? Because you would think that she would have been thrilled to finally have a real diagnosis to exploit, wouldn't you? And instead, both of them lost interest in medical attention once there was actual medical evidence to examine. And I will go into this a little bit further in detail in the research section. In 2010, when Gypsy found her Medicaid card, she realized that she wasn't the age her mother claimed. She was actually 19 and not 15. In February 2011, at a science fiction convention, she met a 35-year-old man named Dan online who saw her chance at freedom. There are two versions of what happened next according to various accounts, but both kind of end up in the same way. In one version, Gypsy went to Dan's hotel room at the convention, but other attendees became concerned about what they thought was a 15-year-old with a 35-year-old man. And in another version, Gypsy made a planned escape. She left a note saying that she wanted to be an independent woman and then hitchhiked to Dan's friend's house at 2 a.m. But either way, Dee Dee tracked her down and convinced her to return home using false paperwork to prove Gypsy was still a minor. And this does come up multiple times in the story, this proof of age thing. She's younger when it's convenient, and then she's older when it's less convenient, like the CBS thing. So this kind of toing and froing with the age really raises alarm bells in my mind. Gypsy claimed after the escape attempt that Dee Dee physically restrained her with handcuffs and dog leashes. But there is a significant issue with this. When police searched the house after the crime, no handcuffs, leashes, or chains were found on the premises. And if you think about that, if these restraints existed, where did they go? Gypsy and Nicholas fled immediately after the crime, so why would they pack restraining devices? This highlights something crucial about Gypsy as a narrator. One interpretation is inconsistency and lying, while the other is the effects of a traumatized brain. It doesn't necessarily mean she's lying. It might mean that years of systematic reality distortion have affected how she processes and recalls events. But also, just as likely, if she's been living with a master manipulator, that she has learned these manipulation skills and is putting them in play. This failed escape attempt could have been devastating psychologically. Gypsy had discovered her real age, found someone outside of Dee Dee's world, made an actual plan for freedom, and it all fell apart. Dan couldn't help her escape properly. Dee Dee's manipulation tactics worked perfectly, and it seemed that any hope of a normal way out was impossible. So, of course, this is where we start seeing the most extreme control measures, which is very interesting to me because this is actually where my mother backed off a bit and just enjoyed the stasis of dependence that she had created. And I think that a deviation in pattern like that when these two women have been running so parallel is very interesting to me. My guess is my mother backed off at this time because she felt confident in her level of control and didn't opt to push further, especially when adulthood is on the table, because at 19, perhaps she felt that if she pushed too hard, it would push me away or I would realize, or whatever the case may be. And I think that there is a very key difference there. While the specific details of these restrictions come from Gypsy's own accounts, which we know have been inconsistent over time, there is broader evidence of extreme isolation and control, just not necessarily a physical restraint. What's documented is that she was prevented from having normal social contact, kept from developing independent living skills, and subjected to increasingly invasive medical procedures that would have absolutely made her more dependent on her mother. But here's where Gypsy's story gets really complex. During this same period, when the reported physical control was at its most extreme, she was also making her most serious attempts at seeking outside connection. The online relationships with Dan and then later Nicholas weren't just teenage romance. They were lifelines to a reality outside of Dee Dee's constructed world. And this is where we need to be really careful about how we interpret Gypsy's actions and statements during this period. Her accounts of these relationships, her level of awareness of her decision-making process have been highly inconsistent over time. And whether we put this down to manipulation after the fact or remembering also what I said about memory reconstruction after trauma. So here's what I see that I think is really, really important from somebody who's lived it perspective and then trying to heal the brain. This is what I see. When Gypsy first told her story, she was coming out of over 20 years of systemic reality distortion. Her brain was trying to make sense of experiences that don't fit normal categories. Add that to a pressure of a criminal case, the isolation of prison, and the absence of therapeutic support for processing this kind of mistreatment. When I think about my recovery journey, I think about a supportive and patient husband who took the time to let me uncover the truth. He let me grow and he nurtured my movement into proper adulthood. I didn't have the media looking at me or a criminal court proceeding or any notoriety at all. I really don't think I would have made the recovery that I did if I also had to deal with that level of emotional stress going on as well. So my point being, imagine this. You sit down for an interview 2 months out from the crime, 2 months out from breaking free. You say A, B, and C. Then you settle into your life in prison, you start working through your memory and your trauma, and your brain is starting to be able to make sense of things. And then you realize, well, A is actually T, B is N, and C didn't happen at all. And now you look like a liar. And I don't doubt, because I think there's very clear evidence that Gypsy has manipulated things since the arrest for the crime. Even if we're looking at the absolute best case scenario, which clearly Dee Dee was exploiting her daughter for financial gain, if we go that route, that is still going to require some healing from trauma on a psychological level. So it's difficult to know exactly what with Gypsy is just a jumble due to brain being brain at that time and what is out-and-out manipulation. A good example, I think, is I finally got around to watching the HBO documentary Mummy Unalived and Dearest. I'm thinking I would actually like to do a whole chapter on this documentary because I'm not super happy about the way everything was portrayed. I think it was very biased in one direction, and I think it could have benefited from a little bit of balance going on there. But Gypsy is sitting there in these interviews in this documentary talking about how she thought she was a princess and how she always thought that, you know, the Prince Charming would come along and all of this stuff that kind of really infantilizes her, that I think in those interviews was almost all manipulation, compared with potentially some of the very earlier interviews may not have been as much manipulation. It's very hard to tell. Tell me if you would like a breakdown of that documentary. I'll do a whole just chapter on it. I think it's a very interesting documentary to analyze for many reasons. Some evidence suggests Gypsy knew more about her real age and physical capabilities during this period than she initially claimed. There are reports of her walking, even when she thought no one was looking, of her being more aware of normal life through her online interactions. But here's the thing, even if she had significant awareness, that doesn't mean that she felt like she had real options. She had no money, no identification, no real understanding of how the adult world worked. Even if we're looking at it from a perspective of that best case scenario where Dee Dee is just a serial committer of fraud, that's still not giving Gypsy a good foundation of knowing how the world actually works. Everyone she had ever known reinforced Dee Dee's narrative. Even if she could walk, even if she knew her real age, she was still psychologically conditioned to believe that she needed her mother for survival. The escape attempts through online relationships make perfect sense when you understand them as desperate bids for outside validation and support. This is where we see what I suspect to be the unconscious rescue-seeking pattern I mentioned earlier playing out in Gypsy's life. If you remember back to my first video, I said this was unconscious for me. I felt like it was always there. I am just posturing the idea that this may have been the case for Gypsy as well, or maybe she was very consciously aware of it. So the details about the relationship with Dan are pretty limited, but what we know suggests Gypsy was reaching out to someone from completely outside her controlled environment, for someone who had been systematically isolated from normal social contact. An online relationship would have felt like a lifeline to reality. But here's what's important to understand about these connections. I found in my situation, when you've been living in a manufactured reality your entire life, you don't necessarily know how to evaluate people or situations normally. Your danger radar is completely scrambled because the person that was supposed to protect you was actually the source of harm. Although it may not be a conscious thought, on some level you know that, and you know that your situation is not what it should be, especially as you get older. So the men Gypsy connected with online, let's just say, may not have been the healthiest choices for someone in her vulnerable position. And I have a serious question mark in my mind about the men that she was seeing in prison as well. And then the delving straight into a relationship on her exit from prison makes me a little bit wary. I am not going to lie, I got so lucky to meet the man that I met, because looking back on it, I was in an extraordinarily vulnerable position, and I think the wrong person could have very easily have taken advantage of that situation. So then came Nicholas Godejohn, and this is where the story takes its darkest turn. From what we know, Gypsy met Nicholas online through a Christian dating site. For someone desperate for a connection and validation from outside Dee Dee's world, this relationship may have felt like salvation, or at worst, was she looking for somebody who was more vulnerable and being able to be used in that way? But we really need to be careful here about how we interpret what happens next. The relationship quickly became adult and intense. Nicholas has his own set of psychological issues, has been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, and a fairly limited intelligence level. Two people with significant trauma and psychological challenges connecting online, that can be a volatile combination, even under the best of circumstances. The conversations between them, which were documented through their online communications, show a relationship that escalated quickly from romantic connection to discussions about escaping Dee Dee's control. And eventually those discussions turned into game over scenarios. And this is where people really struggle with Gypsy's story. How does somebody go from victim to participating in this sort of thing? This is where the quote-unquote pick a team mentality really kicks in. People want her to either be pure victim or manipulative unaliver. But as with most things in life, the reality is much more complex and takes on shades of grey. It's possible that we might be looking at someone who has been systematically conditioned to believe that her survival depended on another person, who had been taught that resistance was dangerous, who had no real understanding of normal options for leaving a mistreatment situation. And then you add someone like Nicholas, who may have presented escape through violence as the only viable option to somebody potentially with Gypsy's psychology that may have seemed logical. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, I do really question how deeply that narrative went in Gypsy's mind, because she really did present herself as the damsel in distress who was being rescued by this man who was willing to do anything for her. Did they just get carried away together? Was this like a, we've fantasized so much, but now we've hyped each other up into actually doing it? Or was this Gypsy's plan the whole time? Or was this something that Nicholas had always wanted? He came with his own set of legal issues, certainly not on this level, but it's such a complex situation that there are so many questions around this. Without a doubt, multiple villains, multiple victims. One thing that we do know for sure, but for Gypsy, Nicholas would not have committed the crime. He didn't know Dee Dee prior to this. It was Gypsy's hand pointing him towards the target that caused this crime to happen. So this is where my story obviously diverges significantly from Gypsy's. When I met my husband, he started questioning my mother's narratives and the stories that she would tell. I knew without a doubt in my mind that there could be a life of no contact. And I knew without a doubt that escape was possible, that I could cut ties and survive independently. But how did I know that? I think it's because despite my mother's control and her fabrication of almost everything in my life, I still had some external reference points. So I still went to school, both primary and high school, in an actual school, not homeschooled. I had friends. I had glimpses of how other families functioned. I still had some, but very limited contact with my father. And I had learned very limited, but some basic life skills. While I didn't have an understanding of how to necessarily navigate the adult world, I felt that my husband's support was going to be enough to enable me to grow. And thanks to my mother's horrible managing of finances, I at least got to learn very, very early how to budget and how to manage money, which is, let's be honest, a very large factor when you're heading into the adult world. So I at least had that sort of grounding going on. But for Gypsy, the isolation was total. She had no baseline for what healthy relationships looked like. She had never learned those basic adult survival skills. She had no money, no understanding of how to navigate systems independently. The community reinforced that she literally needed Dee Dee to survive. This is all she would have had said to her constantly. And the physical quote-unquote evidence, the wheelchair, the feeding tube, the medical devices, may have made independence seem impossible. So when Nicholas came along and they decided that violence was a solution, it may have been the only escape route that she could conceive of, especially considering a previous failed one. Not because she was inherently violent, but because her reality had been so systematically constrained that to just leave wasn't in her mental framework of possibilities. She may have seen that any attempt to run, any attempt to escape would just result in Dee Dee dragging her back. The final breaking point seems to have developed as Gypsy's desire for independence collided with Dee Dee's increasingly desperate control measures. By this point, Gypsy was in her early 20s, legally an adult, though the community still thought she was a teenager. The gap between her actual developmental needs and her enforced helplessness was becoming impossible to maintain. Through her relationship with Nicholas, Gypsy was getting validation that her situation wasn't normal. Someone from outside Dee Dee's constructed reality was confirming what part of her had probably suspected for years, that she was being controlled and manipulated. But here's where Nicholas's own psychological issues become crucial to the story's trajectory. From the documented communications between them, it appears that Nicholas presented the situation in very black and white terms. In his framework, Dee Dee was a villain who needed to be eliminated, and violence was not just an option, but potentially the only option. And absolutely no doubt in these communications that a great deal of this was fueled by Gypsy. There's no point where Nicholas, in his framework and in his intellectual ability, had stepped out and gone, I'm going to get another side to this story. He just wholeheartedly believed everything that Gypsy told him. Think about it from her psychological perspective. She had been conditioned her entire life to see the world in terms of complete dependency. Either you were under someone's protection and control, or you were in mortal danger. The concept of gradual independence, of setting boundaries, of seeking help from authorities, these weren't in her mental toolkit. Evidently, otherwise something else would have eventuated from this situation. So this may have fit into her existing framework. To be free from Dee Dee's control, Dee Dee had to be completely eliminated. There was seemingly no middle ground in her psychological landscape, no concept of I can leave and still be safe. The fateful night happened June 2015. Nicholas traveled to Missouri and attacked Dee Dee while she slept. Gypsy was in another room during the actual killing, but she had participated in the planning and let him in the house. Afterwards, they were intimate, which Gypsy later claimed to be non-consensual, and posted on Facebook alerting to the fact that Dee Dee was no longer with us. The aftermath shows just how unprepared Gypsy was for reality outside of Dee Dee's control. Within days, they were caught, and suddenly Gypsy was facing the adult world she had never been prepared for. Police, lawyers, consequences that she had never learned to anticipate. And in the interrogation footage, we can actually see Gypsy falling back on skills that she had learned, which was to be meek and to be fragile and to be very girl-like in her actions. And this is pretty much how she conducted herself moving forward until her conviction. I think that, yes, it can be a manipulation because on one level you know it works, but that's no different than anybody else's coping mechanism either. But on another level, you kind of have conditioned yourself to this as your response, so that's what you fall back on. And in a moment of immense stress, which being arrested and being interrogated by police would be immense stress, these are the familiar things that you fall back on. It's just unfortunately or fortunately, they were not going to work in the real adult world outside of the Gypsy Dee dynamic. Part 3. Research, analysis, and the mixed motivations framework. All right, nuggets. Now that we've walked through both my experience and Gypsy's story, let's bring the research in and start connecting all of these dots, because here's where it gets really interesting from a behavioral analysis standpoint. Now, bearing in mind that there is no diagnosis for Dee to have FDIA or malingering or anything like that, but I did want to bring these topics in. One, because of my experience and how it does relate, what I see in Dee compared to my mother. It's very, very similar. But also because this was brought up a lot in the court proceeding, because to bring up mitigating factors that would have reduced Gypsy's term or potentially even her actual conviction, they needed to determine, was she a victim of FDIA? Or was Dee just a malingerer and not actually doing anything to exacerbate the issue? So let's talk about what the research actually tells us about these conditions, because I think it explains both my experience and potentially Gypsy's in ways that the usual either-or thinking doesn't quite capture. So if you want to pick a team, this is going to get very uncomfortable for you. I'm just going to tell you now. Factitious disorder imposed on another, which used to be called Munchausen Syndrome By Proxy, is categorized by a caregiver deliberately fabricating or inducing medical symptoms in someone else. Now, note the word fabricating. This is not necessarily meaning that they are making their victim unwell. It could just mean that they're implying that they have, or telling doctors that they have conditions, potentially making it look like they have conditions that they don't have. It's not always putting salt in the IV, for example. As I mentioned in my story, a lot of this was just like making up allergies for me. So while some of it was making me ill, a lot of it was not. It was just fabricating the medical symptoms. The key diagnostic criterion that everyone focuses on is that this behavior happens without obvious external rewards. It's supposed to be driven by internal psychological needs, the attention, the identity as the devoted caregiver, the control over another person's reality. Malingering by proxy, on the other hand, which by the way is not an actual psychological condition, involves the same kinds of behaviors, but with clear external motivations: money, benefits, avoiding legal consequences, that kind of thing. Now, the textbook definition makes it sound like these are completely separate, mutually exclusive categories. You're either doing it for psychological reasons or you're doing it for material gain. But what the research is starting to show, and what both my story and maybe Gypsy's story illustrate, is that real-world cases are much messier than our diagnostic categories allow for. Based on the research and my experience, what might actually happen and why the either-or framework misses the mark, the pattern typically starts with pure psychological motivations. The caregiver gets this psychological payoff from the attention, the sympathy, the identity as this incredibly devoted parent dealing with impossible circumstances. That was certainly true in my mother's case for the first 10 years. There was no material benefit, just the social status and the control that she got from having a quote-unquote special child who needed constant care. But over time, external benefits can start to accumulate. People donate money, offer help, provide services. Organizations step in with support. Benefits become available. And once those benefits appear, they become part of what maintains the behavior, but they don't necessarily change the underlying psychological disorder. Think about it like this. I started my YouTube channel because I loved analyzing behavior and connecting with people who were interested in these stories and teaching from experience to encourage thinking about alternate perspectives. But now I'm monetized and I'm getting paid. So does that mean that I was only creating content for the money all along? Of course not. No, I'm not going to decline the pay, and it's nice that it sustains what I'm doing, but my original motivations, the teaching, the connection, the helping people through storytelling, those are still exactly the same. It doesn't change my core motivation. This pattern seems to match what we see in Dee Dee's case. The evidence suggests that the core pattern was established long before any major financial benefits appeared. She was doing this for years before Hurricane Katrina, before charitable donations, before the big disability benefits. The psychological motivations, the medical knowledge obsession, the complete reorganization of her life around Gypsy's fabricated illnesses, the social identity as this sacrificial mother, those all scream factitious disorder imposed on another. But as external benefits accumulated over the years, they likely became part of what she was protecting. By the end, she wasn't just protecting her psychological identity as Gypsy's devoted caregiver, she was also protecting the house, the donations, the financial support, the community status. And I am hoping that that is her motivation for changing Gypsy's age on the birth certificate, because I said it in my last video, I'll say it again, I really hope that that was financially driven. It doesn't make it okay. It certainly makes it still mistreatment of a very high degree, but it seems more palatable to say it was a financial motivation to be able to keep these things going for longer. So here's where it gets even more complex. The research on mixed motivations in these cases suggests that the psychological and material benefits can become intertwined over time, making it difficult to determine which came first or which is the primary driver. What starts as one type of motivation can evolve to include elements of both, or potentially have one overtake the other. This is why I think the mixed motivations framework is so crucial for understanding cases like Dee Dee's. When we only look through the team picking or the either-or lens, we completely miss the complexity of how these situations actually develop and evolve. If we dismiss Dee Dee's case as just malingering because of the financial benefits, we ignore the decades of psychological patterns that were clearly established before those benefits appeared. We miss the sophisticated medical knowledge obsession, the complete life reorganization around Gypsy's care, the social identity construction, all the hallmarks of someone whose psychological needs were being met through this caregiver role. But if we insist it was just pure FDIA and ignore the material benefits entirely, we're not being honest about the full picture either. Dee Dee had a fairly lengthy history of committing financial fraud, and I think that this evolved into another form of it for her. By the end, Dee Dee was absolutely protecting her financial interests alongside her psychological ones. This matters for several reasons. First, it helps us recognize these cases earlier. If we're only looking for the most extreme presentations, or if we dismiss cases that have some material benefits, we're going to miss people who need help. The research shows that FDIA exists on a spectrum, from subtle manipulations, like I experienced, or perhaps even more subtle, to extreme cases, potentially like a Gypsys. Second, it helps us understand why victims like Gypsy might have mixed awareness and make choices that seem contradictory. When motivations are complex and evolving, the victim understands and responses are going to be complex too. And third, it explains why some of these cases seem to blur the lines between different diagnostic categories. Human behavior is just messier than our categories allow for in so many ways. People can have multiple motivations or psychological conditions operating simultaneously, and those motivations can change over time. And here's where the mixed motivation framework reveals a fundamental flaw in how our legal system handles complex psychological cases. Courts need binary decisions: guilty or not guilty, mistreatment or no mistreatment, victim or perpetrator. But human psychology and motivation are rarely that simple. The legal system struggles with cases like Gypsys because evidentiary standards require provable facts, not psychological speculation. She started with good intentions, but it evolved is nearly impossible to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. Mixed motivations muddy the waters for both prosecution and defense, where each side wants to argue a clean line against the other side. Legal precedent exists so similar cases can get similar treatment. If every case ends up with, well, it's complicated, the system would just completely break down. Juries need a clear framework to make their decisions. Practical consequences then flow from legal determinations, sentencing guidelines, victim services, parole decisions, all depend on fitting cases into established categories. This potentially creates profound injustices on both sides of the coin. Gypsy's case shows how someone can be both victim and perpetrator. The court basically had to pick, was she a mistreated child who unalived her mistreater, or manipulative adult who orchestrated a game over? The nuanced truth? Probably both. In different ways, at different times. And that doesn't fit the legal framework. And as though this isn't complicated and messy enough, please allow me to escalate things. Something even more fundamental that might have been overlooked, something that could completely upend how we understand FDIA. Remember how Dee Dee lost interest in medical attention once Gypsy got a real chromosome disorder diagnosis? Some experts pointed to this as evidence against FDIA, arguing that if she really had the disorder, she would have exploited this real diagnosis. But I think they've got it completely backwards because of that pattern from my own experience. That duality to my mother's actions completely perplexed me for years. Thanks to this research, I actually think I finally have a grip on it. And it fully floored me when I realized that Dee Dee had done exactly the same thing. My mother spent years fabricating elaborate health issues for me. But then, of course, the glandular fever, a real illness, was completely ignored. This is one example to illustrate the point, but offhand, I can think of at least 5 other times that this happened. She didn't just neglect it, but seemed to genuinely be unable to see it as a medical issue requiring attention. And then Dee Dee, of course, seemed to do the same thing with Gypsy's chromosome disorder. Why would both my mother and Dee Dee lose interest when faced with actual medical conditions? After putting myself in my mother's mind, a truly uncomfortable experience, I believe I have the answer. Think about what fake illnesses provide. Complete control over the narrative. The perpetrator is the expert, the devoted caregiver, the one with all the medical knowledge. They can invent symptoms, control timelines, and be the heroic figure managing mysterious conditions. They know the outcome. There is no guesswork, no worry. It's merely enacting a performance to gain the desired currency. Real illnesses take that control away. Real diagnoses mean real doctors who actually know more than the perpetrator. Real treatment protocols that can't be manipulated. Predictable outcomes that don't allow for ongoing drama or attention. Or, if serious enough, actual stress, concern, worry, and a potentially devastating outcome. With fake illnesses, they're the star of the show. With real illnesses, they become just another worried caregiver among actual medical professionals. I'd always been left with the feeling that my mother indulged the illnesses so long as it was convenient in timing and method. But as soon as I was actually unwell at a time that she perceived as inconvenient, I was put in my room and made to feel like a burden. This pattern, ignoring real medical needs while fabricating fake ones, shouldn't be seen as evidence against FDIA. It should be seen as a key diagnostic indicator because it reveals that this was never really about the medical care or being a devoted caregiver. It was about control, expertise, and psychological payoff that only a fabricated condition could provide. It's quite simply on their terms or not at all. If I'm right about this, it means experts have been fundamentally misunderstanding these cases. And Gypsy's story, my story, who knows how many others, with all of its complexity and mixed motivations, makes a lot more sense when viewed through this lens. Part 4. Understanding reality manipulation through an ancient story. Now, I want to offer you one more way to think about this kind of experience. Anybody who has gone through gaslighting or who has gone through trauma as a child with a controlling parent, I think it helps us understand how profound this kind of psychological manipulation can be. It certainly helped me a great deal to reconcile my history and journey through learning that basically my entire life was a lie, which is nothing short of earth-shattering to deal with. So I heard a story. About 2,400 years ago, a Greek philosopher named Plato told a story to help people understand how we learn what's real and what isn't. And honestly, when I first heard the story during my recovery, it was like someone had perfectly described what I had been through. So picture this. Imagine prisoners chained in a cave since birth. They can only look straight ahead at a wall. Behind them, people carry objects in front of a fire, casting shadows on the wall that the prisoners can see. The prisoners think these shadows are reality. They've never seen anything else. Then one prisoner gets freed. He turns around and sees the fire, the objects, and the people who are creating the shadows. It's overwhelming and confusing. His whole understanding of reality has just been shattered. He's dragged outside into the sunlight and discovers a whole world that he never knew existed. When he returns to tell the other prisoners, they don't believe him. The shadows are all they've ever known. So why would they trust this crazy story about real objects and sunlight from this guy who seems completely out of his head? This story might help explain something about how we understand reality. We can only work with the information we're given. If someone controls all the information you receive since birth, they're not just lying to you, they're building your entire understanding of what's possible. In my view, this mirrors Gypsy's experience. And whether you want to consider DD with FDIA or just perpetrating financial fraud, it still applies. DD didn't just tell her lies, she constructed Gypsy's entire reality. The medical conditions, the wheelchair, the medications, even her age, these were all the shadows on the cave wall. They seemed real because they were all Gypsy had ever known. And when you start to realize the truth, when you start to realize all of the lies, that everything had been fabricated, it's like being dragged into the sunlight. It's overwhelming, it's disorienting, and it's initially hard to believe. Your whole world just got turned upside down and suddenly you don't know what's real anymore. And it's funny how this continues over time because I'm quite a few years out now from the bulk of my healing, but I'm still finding these little things that I just didn't question in the moment because they hadn't come up or whatever the case may be. And I still have these little like brain exploding moments of, oh, that was just the lie that she had told me. That's not that at all. And it's surreal when it happens still. It's only little things now, but it's still surreal. But what really gets me about this whole thing, when you've been living in somebody else's constructed reality your entire life, even when you start to see the truth, you don't automatically know how to navigate the real world. And this is why I feel all of this analysis is so important to talk about. When we only talk about the most extreme cases, we miss the broader spectrum of this kind of mistreatment. My experience was real and damaging, even though it never reached that kind of level. And there are probably countless people out there who have experienced even milder versions of this reality distortion and potentially don't even recognize it as mistreatment. These cases may not involve dramatic hospital visits or major medical procedures. Sometimes it's home-based manipulation or creating false narratives about allergies and conditions or using fabricated health issues to maintain control and gain sympathy. If we only look at the most extreme presentations, we're going to miss a lot of people who need help. Understanding that motivations can be mixed and can evolve over time. It also helps us to make sense of cases that seem to blur the lines. It's not always a simple matter of psychological versus material motivations. Human behavior is just not that neat and is so much more complex than our diagnostic categories sometimes allow for. And perhaps most importantly, understanding the recovery process, how memory reconstruction works after systematic reality distortion, helps us respond more appropriately to survivors, to not condemn them for their missteps, but to give them space to grow. For people like Gypsy, who may have lived their entire lives in these constructed realities, breaking free is extraordinarily difficult. The psychological conditioning runs so deep that normal escape routes might not seem possible. This does not excuse violence, but it does help us understand how someone could reach such a desperate breaking point. So final thoughts. This was a heavy one, and it was much, much heavier for me to create this than I expected it might be. And you know full well that this has taken me a really long time to feel ready to tackle this story. But I think it's important that we understand these patterns, not just the extreme cases that make headlines, but the full spectrum of how reality can be manipulated and controlled. It's about recognizing that human behavior is complex and messy, and that victims of this kind of mistreatment deserve our understanding, not our judgment. Whether someone escapes through a healthy means like I did, or through desperate but objectively wrong measures like Gypsy did, the underlying patterns of manipulation and control are real and devastating. And so at the end of this, was Dee Dee a questionable mother? Absolutely. There are some core things that are proven that even if it was just those things, we are looking at questionable motivations at best. And I'm talking about the forgery of the birth certificate. I'm talking about the financial fraud involved in those charities because, like, let's be honest, Gypsy does not still have all of those conditions, not all of them. And there was very clear isolation going on there where all they had was each other. A true, well-rounded, supportive parent would make sure that there are peers to interact with and healthy experiences, even if it's within the physiological restraints. It's not keeping somebody at home and that's all they've got. And when it comes to Gypsy, at worst, I'm thinking a completely manipulative person who took advantage of a vulnerable person to cause him to commit a life-changing crime. And at best, trying to navigate her situation the best she could. Nicholas, at worst, was always going to be a danger to people if he could be so easily manipulated into this. And at best, yet another victim in this incredibly complicated story. So if you're still with me listening to this, thank you so much. I appreciate you. I do. And I hope that you're looking forward to the next chapter as much as I am, and we can really delve deep into this together. Like I said, I've got a lot of documentation. I've got a lot of emails to get through. I might filter through to a point to remove any kind of boring or redundant ones, and we can find the really, really juicy ones, but I basically want to go through them all essentially with you. So what I might do is do a small, weird to say, but palette cleanser. Maybe we'll do a Eugenia video, or maybe that Amber Lynn video, chapter 2 for Amber Lynn. We'll see how we go, but then I will come straight back to Gypsy. But that is all the clucks I have left to give. Stay golden, my little nuggets, and I'll catch you next time.
Hey, I'm gonna go watch another video. Let's go!